background is ceramic arts, and I started digging local clays. This is a shot of clay in Maryland. This is about 45 minutes north of Baltimore, in Perryville, Maryland. And this is a friend of mine owns a clay, sand, and gravel mine. And she has cultivated relationships with potters over the years who have discovered this place and discovered the beautiful natural clays that are there. And I was fortunate to get to know her, gosh, maybe back in 2003. So, you know, this really was instrumental in forming my relationship to clay and understanding it as a material that came from the earth, instead of, you know, usually in clay classes, you sometimes, like at the university level, you mix clay, but you buy it in bags and you mix it up in a mixer. But more often, you buy boxes of clay pre-mixed. And so the concept that clay is a material that comes directly from the ground is kind of removed. You know, but for most of the history of ceramics, that has been the case. These images are from 2009. I started also like digging the clay and using the raw clay in my work, and also using pictures. The photographs became work also, because I just loved the compositions and the colors, and you could see cause and effect in the environment. So here, this is in the summer of 2009, I talked friends of mine into helping me collect clay. I did an installation at the Casson Art Museum here in DC. And it was really the first time I was so in love with the natural colors of the clay that I wanted to figure out something I could do with the clay that didn't involve firing it, which changed the colors. I just loved how they were naturally. So this exhibit was called Dirt Drawings, and it was, I think, gosh, I can't even remember how many, 10,000 pounds of raw clay just on the floor in the gallery. And there was nothing on the wall. It was all just clays on the floor. And one of the things I did too was I had noticed how interested I was in the process of what happens to clay in my studio. And when I would make work, I would be the only person who would get to see that. Like, as clay, you know, we poured this puddle. You see here, this is a 20-foot diameter puddle. It was completely wet the night of the opening of the show. And then over the 6 weeks of the show, it dried and cracked. And what was interesting to see is that people would come back and watch it, and see what happened as it progressed. Just these little sort of poetic instances of, you know, when the puddle is thinner, the cracks are smaller, and when it's thicker, the cracks are bigger. So, and this is an outgrowth of some of that work too. So at the end of this exhibition, I just called my friends and said, hey, who wants some of this beautiful clay? And I had about 20 people came, and they just gathered it up into buckets and took it back to their studios to make stuff out of it. So it was a very ephemeral show, which was really, it was fun and freeing in a way, but in another way, as an artist, I really like to have things. So one of the things that I had was the photographs, and kind of going back to that. So this was the site. This is at Stansel, my friend's clay mine. This became the photograph that was a product, that was an actual tangible product. And then I started making these, I call them rammed earth drawings or paintings that used the material like from that clay bank. And also, it didn't just use the material, but it also borrowed from the language of what was happening in the environment. So kind of like stealing some strategies of what's happening there. So, and then, so I was mixing clay with gel medium and nylon fibers and pounding it into these steel frames, backing with mesh, and developing all these systems of how to be able to have an object using raw clay that was durable. And then I started bringing in some mapping imagery. As clay dries, it cracks naturally and kind of lends itself to, it sort of looks like maps. This is a map, this is an 1856 map of Washington, D.C., and I was doing a commission for a site that was right at 2nd and M Northeast, and previously there had been this Tiber Creek that ran through DC that wasn't in existence anymore, but I decided that would be a cool thing that I could highlight. So I made this piece for a lobby of a condominium that talked about the creek that used to be there, that used clay from the construction site, and that even used artifacts from the construction site. So little pieces of brick from the buildings that were torn down, little items from the construction site, bent rebar, orange spray paint on gravel. And this piece was called Tiber Creek and Other Lost Things. And so I really started thinking about how clay could really be, and all these other soils and materials from the ground could really be evocative of a place and could be used to tell a story. Anya, this will be a familiar image to you. Anya was talking about the work that we have worked on together with Urban Soils Institute. This is from 2012. Dr. Richard Shaw and I got to do a collaborative project at the Museum of Art and Design in New York. I was asked to do a site-specific piece using New York soils, and which was super exciting. I said yes, and then I got off the phone and I was like, I don't know how to do that because I don't live in New York, I live in Maryland. So I got connected. Dr. Ed Landa, soil scientist colleague of mine from University of Maryland here, connected me with Richard Shaw, who had been the lead scientist for the New York City Reconnaissance Soil Survey. So these were soil samples, or actually, Anya, what do you call them? They're actually
profile.
A profile, yeah. So they're
profile, and different mini box is the horizon. So that actually you can see how big and small they are on the first step.
Yeah, so I got these soil profiles. They were left over from the survey had been done, and the product was, was a document. And the soil samples themselves were left over. They were in cardboard boxes. They were in a storage room. They were going to be disposed of. And what Richard Shaw and I got to do was take them and and I created these plexiglass boxes instead of the cardboard boxes. So we could really let the beauty of the soils draw people in, and then we could start to tell the stories of these soils. And I'll show you a little more about that. These are the same profiles that we recontextualized at Governor's Island in the Urban Soils Room. These are just some more images. Our clays from Maryland. This is right near my house. And, again, you'll see, so this is a piece that I made that sort of it uses the clay from the site and it steals some strategy. You see that horizon line kind of shows up again. This lavender clay is a natural Maryland clay, as is the gray. Then this is kind of another take on the layering. This is 4 separate steel frames, and I don't know if you can see, it's kind of hard to see, I'm sure, from where you are, but I've sorted it with the fine particles at the top, and then they get coarser as they go down. So this is just kind of like stealing some strategy from soil science, sort of natural particle sorting, and using it as a design element. This is some more mapping. This is a recent piece that I did. Again, taking material from a construction site. This is right here in my neighborhood. So here's what I collected. And then thinking about, you know, I knew the size piece I wanted to make. And I also collected some detritus from the site, some bent rebar, or not rebar, but cable, frayed cable, and some angle iron that's been run over, and then sort of using those elements to reference the map of the area. And just kind of like playing around, not trying to be too literal, but just a little bit suggestive to talk about the place. And so here I'm sort of using that rammed earth technique again, kind of pounding them into the steel frame. Coming back on top, I end up making a lot of my own tools. This is a pizza cutter that I replaced with a bicycle chain wheel, so I can make a little perforating pouncing tool. You can see I rolled it across my lines to make dotted lines in the clay. And this is a technique I use a lot. Talk about how clay behaves. When it dries, it cracks, but if you disturb the surface, it will crack with respect to the disturbance. So if I draw a line, cut into it, the cracks will start there. So that's kind of a way that I can draw into the clay and then let the language of the clay kind of work from there. So I think about it like I'm collaborating with the material. I have a voice and the material has a voice. And then if I'm lucky, they work together really nicely and create this new thing. And here's, we installed it in, this is some apartments that are right here in the neighborhood. And it's right by the window where you can look outside and see these two types of soil. This is Christiana soil that we have here in Maryland. These two colors of clay are in that soil profile, and you can look outside. You can't see those colors in the ground because now the construction's done, the ground's covered up, but it's sort of a way that you can connect with what's under the ground once it's sealed up. This is another mapping piece I did. This is in Prince George's County, kind of southern Prince George's County. MGM National Harbor. MGM built a casino and hotel, and I was fortunate enough to get to do a piece for them. So again, I kind of took some of the strategies from that Tiber Creek piece, did some research on maps from the area, you know, did some cropping to find a good composition. This is a current map. I do like those older maps because they're less about highways and more about, you know, rivers and creeks. And then this is the construction site. I was able to get some clay from the construction site, and I didn't even know what the clay was going to look like until they had already accepted the proposal and we were well into our agreement of doing this before I even saw the clay. So it's interesting, it's variegated. Probably it is not naturally deposited like this. Anya, you could probably help with this, but I assume it's on the banks of the Potomac, but also I would assume that it's been disturbed probably numerous times with, you know, different construction projects and different fill being added back on top of it. So I did some, this is in my studio. It's the piece is 30 feet by 18 feet. I did some separating out of the colors and kind of, I used some of the clay as workable clay to kind of make the the areas of the map, the drying and cracking, using the tools to kind of help it crack along the map lines. And then I separated out some of those colors to almost make like pastels and watercolor washes to go back on top to kind of coax certain areas of color to come out. You can see here I also use some of the detritus, like there's a nut and bolt and some roots from the site, just kind of add some texture. So, and one of the things I like is at the hotel here, the people that work behind the desk, they really like the piece and they like the story. The artifacts, there's a chunk of clay that shows one of the workmen helped me pull clay out of the ground. It has its finger marks in it. So it makes it personal and they're able to tell the stories. The clay tells the stories and then they find those compelling and they share them. So, I think that's kind of a cool thing for the work to be able to do. This is a piece from kind of continuing that mapping tradition I did last summer in the middle of COVID, summer 2020. It was kind of nuts. Here's another piece coming kind of from that series, the mapping, the blue and white kind of blueprint. I mean, this is not so much using material from the site, but it's kind of continuing that idea of mapping and pulling in some blueprint imagery. This is actually a map of ancient Rome that I did for some clients here in DC pretty recently. There's a little bit of my Mount Rainier, Maryland red clay snuck in there. This is a nice counterpoint. To get these maps that show, here's the Hudson soil profile that we're looking for. And this is some engineers that are there in the Troy area. So kind of we're able to put the, Olga's soil science, GIS system investigations overlapped with the engineers. So in Troy, y'all have heard of Uncle Sam, the Uncle Sam. So he was like a real person who lived in Troy, New York. So Samuel and Ebenezer Wilson were brothers, and they started a brickworks in Troy. And this was kind of at the height of the Hudson River brick industry, from the mid 1800s to the early 1900s. There were maybe 50 brickyards along the Hudson River. And one of the reasons it was so popular was because it didn't require a lot of infrastructure. Like if you were, a young man from a family that didn't necessarily have a lot of money, all you needed to do was have a shovel and go outside and dig some clay and fire it, and you had a brick. And once you had a brick, you could make a kiln, and then you could fire more bricks, and you could just scale it up with zero infrastructure. And so it was a way for people to start businesses. And with New York City growing, and there was a ever increasing need for bricks. So this is how we sort of put all this together for this commission, is to do some exploring, figure out where we could get clay, and if we could get it from Uncle Sam's brickyard, what a great story that is. And then not only am I going to make this commission for this guy, but we can also use it to bring in the local school kids, let them dig clay. We can use it to talk about the history. We can use it to talk about the soil science. If you give a kid a little ball of clay and let them make a pinch pot, there's Olga. She's helping us out with the soil web with her GIS. She was great, helping us in that whole site figure out where we were most likely to find the clay that we were looking for. But our idea is, if we're going to this much trouble, who else would benefit from this? So seeing this picture, this is my client on the left, Steve Hartman. He's actually CBS News guy, has a house in Troy. And so he's, of course, interested in the story, because that's kind of that's what he does, you know. This is Bianca Groves. She is a potter in Troy. And this is, oh my gosh, I forget this woman's name, but she's also a potter who had started making some Troy brick molds. So I reached out to both of them and said, hey, are y'all interested? So everybody has kind of got this little piece of interest in the project. The city of Troy is interested in turning up the volume on one of their local treasures, you know, Uncle Sam, and kind of using it to talk about the history of the city. So here's an interesting thing. You'll see our site was like up on top of the hill where we were digging. Now in Troy, so this bank was their brickyard. Like, this was the bank that they dug the clay from for their brickyard. And not uncommon, this happened a lot in a lot of cases, they sort of over dug more than the structure of the hillside could stand, and there was a catastrophic mudslide at a certain point. And what you can see in this picture, see these like bumps in the road. So there's actually, and then this is a kind of a wall, that like a retaining wall. There was, I don't know, in the early 1900s maybe, a catastrophic collapse. And a good chunk of the hill like slid down the hillside and like killed some people, killed some horses, collapsed some buildings. You know, and now it's just like, that's so long in the past, but there's still this visible, the lumps there kind of exist to tell that story. So anyway, that's kind of, you know, it's a lot and it's kind of meandering, but it does kind of maybe show a little bit about what we're up to, about how we can let the material, how we can let the clay sort of tell the story. And how we can let people kind of dig into it with their own interest. Urban Soils Room at Swale. So what is Swale? What is the Urban Soils Room? First of all, Governor's Island is this island in New York City. It's actually in Brooklyn. And it used to be, it's partially natural, and then about half the island was added onto, was man-made from dredge material from dredging the waterways in New York City. And it was military housing and has this old fort on it. And so what's happened then is there are all these old military houses from the 1800s, and they have no money to keep them up, so it's a trust who owns the island. Their idea of bringing money and interest to the island was to offer these houses to artists and arts organizations, to do what we wanted to do with them, and to do something that brings interest to people coming to the island. So we partnered with Swale, which is Mary Mattingly is an artist in New York City, and she's mostly known for her project named Swale. It's a floating food forest in New York City. There are laws in New York about foraging edible food on public land, and it's illegal. And so she decided to build a barge, and if it was in the water, then she could make a food forest where people could eat, you know, food for free. And it was maritime law, so she didn't have to go by the same law. So she's about food justice. She's about environmental issues. She invited Urban Soils Institute and Richard Shaw and I to bring our, you might remember the image I showed of the piece from Museum of Art and Design. So we got to recontextualize it here in this room. You can see it's the same soil samples, but they're sort of laid out differently. We got a chance to do a map specifically for these soils and where they came from. We got a chance to talk about urban soils. We have a library. We highlighted some samples in particular to talk about, like, you know, what's special about this series. Why are we talking about it? So it was a very cool opportunity. And Anya, I don't know if you know this, but I think that chapter is coming to an end.
Oh, why?
I know. Well, so, and you see here, we would also use the house to do, you know, as Anya said, she did some programming there. It was like a soils library that, you know, USI scientists and other people could use for programming. And one of the things we did was monthly free soil testing. Know about that, but we're looking into some more industrial properties to be able to do whatever the next iteration of the soils room is, and how we can use that for programming. There's Olga. I've got some pictures of you in here, Anya. That's why I wanted to flip through these. There's Rich. So, and here's Rich. He's talking about, like, you know, we got a chance to sort of classify, you know, the different sort of categories of soils, like the dredge materials. So Big Apple, which is one of the profiles we looked at, is a dredge soil. Mostly anthropogenic soils that we're talking about here. Anya, remember this? This was in 2019. This was Candace's Curb Urban Resilience Banquet. And it's such a great place to hold an event and to, you know, talk about the soils and the importance of the soils. Make some art. You still have that painting?
Actually, it's in the Swale house somewhere. And
This is
the one we used last week.
This is from the summer, doing some soil testing. So yeah, it was an amazing place, and but yeah, I think, you know, now we're going to have to invent what's the next iteration of that. And let's see. So this is from 2003, the Sedona. So this piece, these people went on vacation to Arizona, and they went on this hike, and it just was so meaningful to them. They collected soil from different points along their route, and they brought them to me. You know, they came back from the hike and they had all these bags of soil and this map and this story and this rock, and they said, will you make us something? And, you know, and this was a very modest size. I mean, this is like 17 by 16 inches. So this is pretty small compared to some of the other pieces. But, you know, so I kind of just used the material sort of in the proportions that they had collected them and just made this piece. But yeah, so it usually starts with an existing work, and then people have their own ideas about, you know, what they would specifically like. This is my studio, Red Dirt Studio. I have my studio here that you see behind me. I'm in one of these pairs of bay doors, and then the rest of the studio are smaller studio spaces. We have 30 artists here, so it's like an artist incubator. Used to be this old fire department. But yeah, I'll show you a little bit about what we do here. This is the Urban Soils Institute website, and if you look at there's a tab called Art Extension. from that piece that Richard Shaw and I did together, we sort of developed this idea that that art really could perform a vital function for science, which was to provide something compelling, could be an object that's compelling and beautiful and invite people's curiosity. So kind of from that piece, you know, that's what the soils room turned into. But then also we formulated, we added on the Art Extension Service to Urban Soils Institute, which is a place to either a physical, where physical collaborations can happen, such as at Swale House. Actually, Anya was, Anya, you and, oh my gosh, what's his name? I'll have to go back here.
Don't.
Yeah, Don, right? So this was in 2019. Y'all were our very first artists in residence there. So, you know, we have a physical place to invite artists and science collaborations. And then also, you know, with the pandemic, we realized that we can do it in virtual space too. Some of our 2021, well, all of our 2020 residents were virtual. And then we brought those artists to the Soil Symposium. That's a sort of really interesting layer to add on, like having this science venue to talk about projects. You know, have the scientists comment on the art projects and the artists comment on the science, and see these collaborations foster in real time, see people make connections and start conversations. So that's been pretty cool.